You know, for 40 years, we've all talked about the shadow war, the one fought with proxies and covert strikes. Well, that shadow war is over. As of 3 days ago, the direct conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran that everyone feared, it's here. It's not a possibility anymore, it's a reality, and it's exploding across the Middle East. So let's break down exactly how we got here and what it all means.
You're going to want to remember this date, February 28, 2026. That is the moment. The moment when decades of tension, of sanctions, of proxy fighting finally just boiled over into open, direct military confrontation. To put it simply, everything has changed.
Okay, to make sense of this, because it is moving incredibly fast, we need a clear roadmap. We're going to start with the single strike that ignited this whole war. Then we'll look back at the decades of tension that really set the stage. We'll analyze what the battlefield looks like right now, assess the immediate fallout, and then explore the really dangerous paths this could all take. And finally, we have to grasp the global stakes, because this affects all of us.
All right, so how did this all begin? Well, this wasn't some border skirmish. This started with one of the most audacious, high-stakes military operations you could imagine. A targeted strike aimed right at the very heart of the Iranian regime.
The opening move, wow. It was designed for one thing: maximum strategic shock. We're not talking about hitting a military base. No, this was a joint U.S.-Israeli operation that hit the regime's center of gravity, a high-level leadership meeting right in Tehran. And the result? The supreme leader, Khamenei, who's been in power since 1989, he was killed, along with reportedly about 49 of his top military and political officials. The U.S. came out right away, calling it a preemptive strike aimed at enabling regime change. Iran's reaction, as you can imagine, was shock and fury. They called it a great crime and immediately declared 40 days of national mourning.
Now look, an attack like that doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's really the climax of a conflict that's been simmering and escalating for more than 40 years. So the big question is, how did we get here? How did we go from a Cold War to a hot one? This timeline really lays out the key steps that brought us to this brink. It all really starts back in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, which created this deep ideological divide. Fast forward a few decades to 2015 and you get the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which was supposed to limit the country's nuclear program. But then, just 3 years later, in 2018, the US pulled out. And that's when things really started to spiral. Tensions soared, Iran began enriching uranium to near weapons-grade levels, and it all culminated in the first ever direct, the limited, war between Israel and Iran back in June of 2025. After a shaky ceasefire and failed talks just last month, well, the stage was set.
And that brings us to right now. We are just over 72 hours into this conflict, and the military dynamics, well, they're intense, they're asymmetric, and they are expanding by the hour.
What we're seeing on the battlefield is this really intense, asymmetric fight. On the one hand, you have the US and Israel. They've basically established air superiority. We're talking reports of jets flying directly over Tehran. And they've hit something like 1,250 to 2,000 targets, all focused on crippling Iran's ability to fire back. In response, Iran and its axis of resistance, that whole network of allied proxy groups, are absolutely retaliating. We're talking hundreds of missiles and drones launched at Israel, attacks on U.S. bases across the Gulf, and, this is critical, Hezbollah has opened a second front from Lebanon. This is a multi-front war now, there's no question.
And if you want to grasp the sheer scale of the ground mobilization, just think about this one number: 110,000. That's how many reservists Israel has called up. This is not a surgical strike anymore. This is a nation moving on to a full war footing, preparing for what could be a very long and very costly conflict.
Okay, so beyond the actual fighting, the shockwaves from these first 72 hours are already being felt across the region and in the global economy. The consequences are immediate, and they are severe.
The immediate impacts are both strategic and economic. Militarily, the initial strikes have significantly degraded Iran's capabilities. Its air defenses are weakened, its missile launch capacity is reportedly cut in half, and of course, its senior leadership is in chaos. And then there's the economic side. Just the fear of what comes next has already sent oil prices surging, and that's putting immense strain on the global supply chains that we all depend on.
This brings us to the question that's on everyone's mind, right? Where does this go from here? The first 72 hours have been explosive, but the next few weeks, they could literally define the future of the entire Middle East.
Right now, it seems like three potential paths are emerging from this chaos, each with profound consequences. The best-case scenario for the attackers is a contained campaign, where they neutralize Iran's key threats and force a weakened regime to the negotiating table. A more likely and far more brutal path is a war of attrition, with continued airstrikes met by a relentless barrage of Iranian proxy and missile attacks. But the worst-case scenario is a full-blown regional war, pulling in the Gulf states and fully mobilizing all of Iran's proxies, a path that would lead to absolute catastrophe.
And let's be crystal clear about this. No matter which path this conflict takes, this is not just a regional problem. The global stakes are immense, and the outcome will affect every single one of us.
Let's start with the global economy's lifeblood, oil. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical choke points. 20%, that's 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply, passes through that narrow channel. With Iran now threatening to disrupt or even close it, the world is facing the possibility of an immediate and devastating global energy crisis.
And the consequences ripple far beyond the gas pump. A severe oil shock could easily tip the fragile global economy into recession. The prestige and credibility of the United States are on the line. A failure here could embolden rivals like China and Russia. And maybe the most terrifying part of all is the looming risk of nuclear proliferation. As this conflict rages, other regional powers may conclude they need their own nuclear deterrent, sparking a new and terrifying arms race. This is a flashpoint for global instability.
So, that's where we stand. 3 days into a new war with a region in flames and a world on edge. The initial shock has passed, and now the strategic calculations for the next phase begin. The fate of millions and the stability of the global order could be decided by what happens next. The question is, what will the next 7 days bring?
You know, for decades, the fight between Iran, Israel, and the United States has been this simmering shadow war. But in March of 2026, all of that changed. So we're going to break down exactly what's happening, why it's all going down now, and what could possibly come next in this incredibly fast-moving conflict. What we're witnessing right now is no longer some proxy fight or a few limited strikes here and there. No, this is direct, high-intensity, multi-front military combat. The shadows are gone. This is now an open war. So how did this rivalry, which has been simmering for decades, finally just explode into this raging fire? And maybe the most important question of all, where on earth does it go from here? Let's dive in.
To really understand how we got to this point, we have to go back to the one single event that lit the fuse.
It all kicked off on February 28th. There was this incredibly precise, intelligence-driven, joint U.S.-Israeli operation that targeted Iran's absolute top leadership. And the response? It was immediate. Over the next few days, Iran and its whole network of proxies, what they call the axis of resistance, just unleashed these massive waves of missiles and drones. And just like that, a targeted strike turned into a full-blown regional war. I mean, the sheer scale of this initial blow was just staggering. This wasn't just a military strike, it was a decapitation. The operation took out not only the supreme leader, who'd been in power since 1989, but also the heads of the entire military and the really powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. The immediate effect inside Iran was, as you can imagine, total strategic chaos and command confusion. And the stated goal from the U.S.? Well, it was made crystal clear. This quote from President Trump shows you that the objective wasn't just to weaken Iran's military. It was an open call for regime change, which signals a huge shift in strategy. But look, a fire this big needs more than just one spark. To really get it, you have to look at the fuel that's been piling up for decades, just waiting for a moment like this. Yeah, the roots of this thing go way back. You've got key moments like the 2015 nuclear deal, the U.S. pulling out of it in 2018, and even a short, really intense war back in 2025. By early 2026, the situation was just ripe for explosion. Nuclear talks had failed, Iran was weakened by protests at home, and U.S. and Israeli strategists saw a window. They saw what they considered their last best chance to deliver a decisive blow before Iran could potentially get its hands on a nuclear weapon. So that brings us right back to today. How is this war actually being fought? On the ground, in the air, and across the entire region. This is a classic textbook case of asymmetric warfare. On one side, you have the U.S. and Israel, who completely control the skies. They're using that air superiority to hit over 1,000 targets, dismantling Iran's military piece by piece. On the other side, Iran can't compete head-on, so it's responding asymmetrically, launching whatever missiles and drones it has left, activating proxies like Hezbollah, and threatening to choke off the world's energy supply. And if you want to understand the scale of the commitment here, just look at this number. Israel has called up over 100,000 reservists. You don't do that for a small skirmish. That is a crystal clear signal that they are digging in for a long, sustained military campaign. Okay, so this is the question on literally everyone's mind right now. Given everything that's happened, what are the most likely ways this conflict could go in the near future? Well, in the short term, let's say the next 1 to 2 months, most analysts expect this pattern to just continue. The US and Israel are going to press their advantage from the air, while Iran keeps up its asymmetric response. The real wildcards to watch are, 1, how far does this conflict spill over into neighboring countries? And 2, does all this pressure on the Iranian regime finally spark another massive wave of protests inside the country? And this, of course, raises the massive geopolitical question. With Iran under direct attack from the US, are its powerful partners Russia and China going to jump in and intervene militarily? Right now, the expert consensus is a pretty firm no. Look, both Russia and China have condemned the strikes, of course, but they've got their own major problems. Russia is still completely bogged down in its war in Ukraine, and China is laser-focused on its own economic stability and, crucially, protecting its oil supply from Iran. So, while we're going to hear a lot of strong words, direct military help from either country is seen as highly, highly unlikely. But if you zoom out a bit and look at the long term, the future splits into these incredibly high-stakes possibilities. Is it possible the pressure actually leads to a full collapse of the Iranian regime? Or does this just settle into a grinding, ugly war of attrition that lasts for years? The most dangerous scenarios, though, involve a full-scale regional war, or a desperate Iran making a final mad dash to build a nuclear bomb as its ultimate insurance policy. So why should you, maybe watching this from the other side of the world, care about any of this? Because the shockwaves from this conflict are already going global, and they're going to affect everyone. It all starts with this number, 20%. That's how much of the entire world's oil supply passes through one narrow waterway, the Strait of Hormuz, right off the coast of Iran. Any threat to disrupt that single choke point sends immediate shockwaves through the entire global economy. And the impacts just fan out from there. Economically, we could be looking at a massive spike in oil prices and maybe even a global recession. Geopolitically, this is a huge test for U.S. alliances. It could also trigger a really dangerous nuclear arms race in the Middle East. And that's not even mentioning the potential for a massive humanitarian catastrophe in the region. And so we're left with this one fundamental question. Is what we're watching a contained, if brutal, military campaign to neutralize a rival? Or are we watching the opening shots of a conflict that's about to spiral into a new and completely unpredictable global crisis? As of right now, nobody on Earth knows for sure.